that yeah, you're welcome to record. I'm at the Doheny Eye Institute, which is part of UCLA down in Los Angeles. I've been 30 years at USC and about 10 years here at UCLA. But today was the day that we moved into our new building. Actually, I have a picture of it later on. So this is the very first time I've used this computer on this desk in this situation, which is why I'm fumbling about. Anyway, it's a great joy to be able to speak to you. I've been a great fan of the Hurley Lab for a long time. When I sit next to Jim at various meetings, he whispers little nuggets of great interest to me, and I've always enjoyed them a great deal.
Likewise.
Thank you. This is a talk about one of my favorite subjects, and it has to do with an event that occurred, an adventure of mine many years ago when we went to Cuba, and I had a chance to spend a lot of time with Castro. But the topic that pertains to your interest is that there was an epidemic of blindness in Cuba. And the single message I'm going to give is that it was an acquired version of a genetic disease, Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. And that genetic disease, I think, is what perhaps interests you through the mitochondrial dysfunction. It's a maternally inherited mtDNA mutation that changes complex 1 behavior. This is that new building that I moved into this morning. As you can see, it looks pretty unused, and there are a few little obstacles in getting the office to work today, but we've passed them. So this is an epidemic that I think is interesting because it talks about a medical mystery, and I don't know how many MDs are in the group. It was a cause of blindness that hadn't been figured out initially. But it has several layers of politics, intrigue, and just to tantalize you a little bit, even a little sex involved. And it began at Arvo. There are probably a couple of you old enough to remember the days that Arvo used to be in Sarasota, Florida. And I had a timeshare back then. It's really nice having the same place every year. And while I was walking with my little children on the beach, I was approached by two different groups. Actually, the first was Project Orbis, and then a couple hours later, World Health Organization of the UN, both telling me that there was this epidemic, and it was in Cuba and was blinding people, and they figured out that it was the optic nerve. And although they had also figured out that it was virus, they needed somebody who was an optic nerve specialist like me to go. And they thought that since I was so close to Cuba, right there in Florida, I'd be willing to hop over and evaluate the situation. I had the good judgment to say no, because I needed to return to Los Angeles. At minimum, I wanted to check out their story. They said the State Department was all on board with this, but I was very nervous about it. I wanted to build a team. I knew I didn't have the individual talent to do this, and I needed to have a group of people to help me. I wanted to spend some time in the library researching possible alternatives to the diagnosis that had already been made for Cuba. And remember, this in the days before Google. So you actually had to go to a library and flip through some books. And of course, I had to check with my wife, Deborah, who, by the way, was not keen about this. I'll tell you right now that when I spoke with the State Department, I then passed the phone to her, and she spoke with the State Department. And they said, we're in a state of war with Cuba. So once your husband is in Cuba, he's completely beyond anything we can do to help. There's no embassy that he can go to. There's nothing we can do to help him out. And so my wife says, well, then maybe I shouldn't be happy about him going. And they said, oh, I wouldn't worry about the politics. I'm sure that Castro doesn't want to make an international incident by harming your husband. But I would worry about the fact that he's almost certain to come back blind. The studies that we know is that it's a highly contagious virus, and he's going to be there, likely to catch it. So she wasn't too keen. So come back to Los Angeles and look into the possible causes of optic neuropathy. This is a Gary Larson slide, because I love Gary Larson. What's the circumference of the Earth? Who wrote the Odyssey? And the average rainfall of the Amazon basin, 385 inches a year, by the way. Bart, you fool, you can't shoot first and ask questions later. We in ophthalmology know that asking questions early is really fundamental to figuring things out. And so not only did I want to prepare the right questions to ask, but I wanted to coach my team to that same point. And in the research, here's another Gary Larson. Any theories on that, Cummings? Hi, Mom. This is just a partial list of the toxins that will produce an optic neuropathy, not dissimilar to what the Cubans had. Some of the things that interested me most of all were things like the bottom of that list, finger cherries. These are a type of a fruit that grows in trees. The thought being that the Cubans were in a terrible state of famine at this time. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But never before had they been so stressed out with eating. And maybe they were going to different forms of food than they were accustomed to that could have had a poisonous effect. Now, in reality, I've been to Cuba on 5 occasions, but we're only going to talk about the first one, May 1993. And while my larger team deserves credit for it, I'm going to emphasize the nuclear team with Jim Martone and Lily Reyes, who I'll introduce to you later. Lily was the head of my neuro-ophthalmology clinic. She knew how I like to do things. She happened to have been Puerto Rican born and spoke perfect Spanish. And in fact, I provided that information to the Cubans, who said, fine, she's welcome to come, but she would not be the official translator. They would provide that. Jim was the head of Project Orbis. And some of you know that that's that big silver plane that goes around the world and provides a lot of surgical options for places that are too disenfranchised to have it. But made him not only a skilled clinician, but very politically sensitive. And he knew things that got us out of a lot of trouble because of that. But I was also provided by the World Health Organization with 9 members of the World Health Organization, a subgroup called PAHO, Pan American Health Organization. Most of them were PhDs doing a variety of things that might relate. There were also 3 clinicians that they provided. And I ended up meeting them in Miami and actually split the group up. I took the clinicians with me and sent the other 6 on what I jokingly call an end run. This was to satisfy the Cubans who insisted that somebody visit their labs and look over their data. And I didn't want to spend the time doing that. I thought it was more important to get some primary information on our own. So when I'm back in Los Angeles, I get visited by somebody in plain clothes who says that he's from the State Department, and he gives me a package. And it really did say on the top of it, it was a butcher box package, top secret for your eyes only. I didn't take a photograph of the package. I wish I had. And with twine on top of it. And I said to him, you know, I don't have a security clearance. And he says, I know, but you're still allowed to see what's in this package. But I suggest you go in your office and close the door. So I did. I cut the twine, opened it up, and what I found was half of it was newspapers, mostly from Australia, and the other half were printouts written by the State Department, translation of newspapers from other parts of the world. And so this had been heavily reported throughout the world that there was this epidemic going on in Cuba. It just never got to the US because part of our Iron Curtain was a screen of information. But it was useful, even though it was hardly what I would call top secret information. And I was able to use it to compile this list. And this is simply the number of new cases that occurred. Remember, we're now in the second quarter of 1993, but it began a year earlier with only 40 people involved in the first quarter, then 180, and so on. And you can see that it sort of increased, not even exponentially, but then it blew up in early 1993 with these fantastic numbers. Considering that Cuba had a population of 10 million, everybody knew somebody who had gone blind, 50,000 patients. So we got back on a plane and flew from Los Angeles to Miami, where the State Department had arranged a charter to take us to Cuba. And by coincidence on that plane was this movie called A Few Good Men with Jack Nicholson. I don't know if any of you guys are old enough to remember that. But the key part of this movie is that Jack Nicholson is a general who commands the American troops in Guantanamo Bay. And he's trying to make clear to the audience that while everybody in the US is sleeping cozy, and for them the Cold War is really not even so cold, for people in Cuba, they're reminded on a daily basis that we were in a state of war with Cuba. And he has this line where he says, every morning I have breakfast 300 yards from angry Cuban soldiers who would love to kill me. I made the mistake of whispering to Lily, who was shaken up enough by the situation, well, we'll be having breakfast with those soldiers. Lily, by the way, was about 22 years old, recently married, in fact, recently had a baby of a few months of age. And what made her situation particularly awkward was that her husband was Cuban. I mean, he left Cuba when he was only 4 or 5 years old. But her in-laws were Cuban and very anti-Castro, living in Florida. and that her husband had decided not to tell her in-laws that this was going to happen, to try to keep peace in the family. And so Lily was walking right into this situation. So we flew with the charter flight, land in Havana, and the first thing that I'm received by in a little guest house, and by the way, never went through customs, never went through the airport proper, just taken by a couple of limousines to this little shed almost on the side. I get interviewed by CNN, Reuters, BBC, and NKH, and of course I have nothing to tell them. I just landed on the island. Then we go to a much nicer guest house, which I'll call a hotel for the sake of understanding the facilities, but it really was nothing like it. It wasn't even in the city. It was on the grounds of a campus. And I told Lily that we would certainly, I'd requested adjacent rooms, but apparently I had not informed her correctly, because they had given her one of the standard rooms, but they'd given me a suite that included a conference room built into it. And so she comes to my door and complains about that, and at the same time is complaining about a few other things. And I remind her that we have been told by the State Department to assume that we would be bugged 24/7, and she shouldn't be complaining, even if she thought we were private. And then she starts to take some water out of the faucet, and I say, no, I don't know the state of water in Cuba, but I've been on many mission trips, and my first rule is you drink water only out of a bottle. And then for fun, I say to the wall, would you please send up a couple of mineral waters? And about 3 minutes later, there's a knock on the door, and 2 bottles of mineral water are provided to us. Thus confirming the 24/7 bugging. But the nice thing about it is they weren't in the least bit ashamed or clandestine about this process. Now, I was in this suite of rooms that had a terrace, and this terrace looked out on this building. And this apparently was one of the most important buildings in Cuba, and it was certainly the most important building to the American intelligence community. When I came back, I had an arrangement with the NSA that would visit me with regularity. And that is, they could ask me any question, I would answer honestly. But they couldn't do two things. They couldn't ask me to go back with questions, and they couldn't take anything out of my office. They could only look at it. That was the line I drew, figuring they would keep me from being a spy. And the only time we got into an argument, it was on this picture that I had of this building. They really wanted to bring it back to the labs for better analysis. They said, the Americans said, it was the center of Cuban bioterrorism. That this is where viruses and bacteria were being created to poison Americans, which is absurd. You see that building has all those open windows. And later on in other visits, I would hop over the 2-foot fence to go in there to borrow dry ice, and they let me walk in and out freely. So hardly high security arrangement. But the picture does remind us all that things were going on other than the epidemic, that I was dealing not only with the challenge of diagnosis and epidemiology, but politics, international politics. One other thing about this building, almost everybody in that building was a virologist. They call it the biotechnology building, but it was all virology. And this is because if your hammer, all the world's a nail, and the hammer and the intelligent people in medicine in Cuba were all virologists. When Castro looked over the economy of Cuba in the 1980s, he was unhappy about the fact that it was totally based on selling cigars and sugar. And he decided that there was an opportunity of developing a niche in biomedicine, in particular making vaccines. That vaccines were too expensive for most of the third world, and that while Europe and the US used US-made vaccines, Africa, South America, Latin America, and Asia needed vaccines. Cuba could make them. Maybe they weren't even at the quality level of American, but it would save a lot of lives and make a lot of money and establish a better reputation for Cuba. And so that's what happened. And so in the communist system, you don't pick your profession, it's picked for you based on your aptitudes. All the best and brightest were made into virologists, which you'll find out is very pertinent to what happened later. Then we went to that building a couple hours after we arrived, and there was a reception for us. And I was surprised to see that in the middle of the reception was this man. That's Fidel Castro for you young guys. And that's me next to him for everybody who didn't appreciate how much younger I looked back then. And so he's been very gracious talking to us about this, and that this reception would precede what I had asked for, which is a debriefing that would follow. I should mention this picture was taken by Lily, but she ended up being the center of his attention thereafter. He went to her and took her little demitasse away, saying in Spanish, which I understand just a little bit, but this I could follow. You must think ill of us Cubans that we would let such a beautiful woman hold an empty cup. And he took it away and put it on a table. By the time he came back, she had dropped all the papers in her hand that fluttered to the ground, and he scooped them up, and thereafter was always attentive and solicitous to her. That was very awkward for her, of course. And I saw on many occasions, especially when the two of them were alone together, that she had managed to go into her purse and flip out all those photographs of her 3-month-old daughter to show him and remind him. So we went to this conference room next door, and there was about 30 or 40 seats in the conference room, and a dais. And on the dais was a little table, and I was seated in the middle of the table, and on my right was Fidel Castro, and on my left was the translator, who actually was in some of those pictures and always available to us. And the first presentation by one of the generals was this, and this sort of sets the stage, which shows the concentration of epidemic on the island. And basically, it's highest on the left, where the red arrow and the red district called Pinar del Rio is, which, by the way, happens to be where sugar is produced. And then it goes to the blue, and then eventually the green and the orange. And yellow is on the eastern end of the island, except for one little spot where that yellow arrow is actually a spot of white, and that's Guantanamo Bay. So the general made it clear. He said, you'll see that Guantanamo is the only part of the island unaffected, probably because they have a vaccine against this. And we think that some frogmen from the US deposited the virus in Pinar del Rio, where the red arrow is on the west. And it's been spreading with a wave front of approximately 26 kilometers per day from west to east. They had taken all the patients from around Cuba who had gone blind, and they had brought them to Havana to study, and they had put them into the various buildings because the hospital's already filled up, and subjected them to 11 different protocols. We won't go into them because they're all silly, but just to give you an example of one, they were very happy with the ozone therapy, where the blood is taken from one arm, spun through a machine, exposing it to ozone, and then retransfused into the other arm for about 5 or 6 complete turnovers of your blood. And I think, again, the Gary Larson cartoon says it well. Knowing how it could change the lives of canines everywhere, the dog scientists struggled diligently to understand the doorknob principle. And so what was happening here was much the same. The scientists were part of what they call the National Operative Group, about 1,000 of them. And they were working, I won't say 24/7, but really, really hard, and had been doing so for about a year by this time, trying to figure out what this epidemic was about. And some of their efforts I would have called flailing about. Each of the heads of these protocols got up there to say that their protocol was working pretty well, but they defined working as that the patient stopped getting worse. Nobody got better. And in doing all this, Castro was very active. I thought he would sit next to me for 10 minutes and then excuse himself. But in fact, he was the official head of the National Operative Group, and he was actually spiritually, intellectually, the head of the National Operative Group. On one occasion, somebody said that 80% of his patients stabilized, and Castro interrupted him and said, no, it was only 78%. Don't exaggerate. Now, of course, I don't know whether Castro was accurate. I think he was, based on other things he said, or whether you don't contradict the El Comandante, but his word was always the last word. But more interesting was when I started to ask some questions. After a while, I got my mojo. And what particularly baffled me was when I asked about the number of patients who were in orphanages or in the barracks, in the military barracks, or other crowded centers, and how many of them had gone blind. And they admitted that none of them had gone blind, that this was a disease of primarily of middle-class men. I'm sorry, middle-aged men. There's no middle class. There's only one class in Cuba. And that it wasn't being seen at the extremes of age or in the congested areas like orphanages. And that led me to ask about the spinal tap, which they said grew out nothing but virus. And I asked how many white blood cells were in the spinal fluid, because you can't have a viral meningitis without white blood cells. And that's when the guy talked about how they were growing out the virus in monkeys, and they were sure that it was done right. And after 2 times not answering my question, Castro says in Spanish, with the translator whispering in my ear, that means bullshit. Don't bullshit Sadun. And then they did admit to that point that there were no white blood cells in the spinal fluid, which makes no sense. Now, my mentor, Simmons Lasella, taught me that a little bit of really accurate data is worth all the garbage in the world. And so I wanted to go back and re-examine the patients and extract from them a real neuro-ophthalmological evaluation. So the process involved a lot of history taking. The history would be taken by the PAHO group, you see that there, then by me with a translator, and then maybe this was the ace in the hole that I had, most of all by Lily speaking her Spanish in private, in a room, in the dark, while she was waiting for them to dilate. As you see here, as we're doing the first of these histories, there's a very skinny patient in front of us. But while at this moment she's looking at the neurologist from PAHO, most of the time she's looking past my shoulder because behind me were all the cameras of the BBC and NKH and Reuters and so on. And then behind them were three completely fully decked Cuban generals, and she'd look at them. And Martone, in his wisdom, stopped all this after 5 minutes and says, she's much more interested in the reaction she's getting from everything else and not on giving you an accurate history. Everybody has to get out. The cameras were quickly thrown out, but the generals insisted they'd been told by Castro that they had to stay and observe everything. And Martone played hardball. He said, well, then we're going to take the next flight back because this is not a meaningful history. And I've heard Dr. Sadun talk about how history is everything. So the generals have to leave. And 15 minutes later, the generals were told to leave and did. What actually transpired, of course, I don't know, but the history got better. So here's the same story about Martone throwing out the cameras and the generals and our history taking. I had some pretty amazing people with me. There's Jim Martone, of course, helping me with this neurological exam on a very skinny guy. That's Rocky Rufi Mendoza, who has published dozens of papers on how to do a visual field. He was my visual field tech. Everybody was skinny and had gotten skinny. We couldn't get accurate numbers of how much weight they lost, but the PAHO people told us that we could make a translation based on notches of the belt. So we asked them to show us their belts, and we could see that they'd lost a couple of notches. And there was an actual conversion that the World Health Organization uses. I don't remember, but maybe it's 8 kilos per notch or something like that. And in the end, we decided that most of our patients had lost 30 pounds in the last few months. These are some glasses that I designed and patented that use cross-polarizing filters to adjust how much light goes to the eye. It's not important. It had no role to play with the epidemic. What's important is to say that Castro asked about the glasses, even though I didn't mention them. Somebody had told him, probably that woman who's a translator, who would slip out every evening to talk, to leave me and meet with him. And while he asked me to explain how the glasses work, I took out a piece of paper to show that there was a normogram that told you how many degrees you turned it to produce how much reduction of light. And he says, why do you need to have that normogram? Can't you do the math in your head? I said, no. And I was patronizing him at this point. It's not linear. It's more complicated than that. He says, of course it is. The amount of light transmission is going to be cosine squared theta. And I, of course, was shocked that he said that. And I told him the truth, which is that when I published it, I used that exact relationship, but that I did it on the basis of letters that I'd sent to my two brothers, who were both mathematicians, by the way. And whenever they wrote back with the same answer, I didn't read too carefully. I just knew that it was likely to be true and used it. And he says, well, you should have been able to figure it out. Here's how you do it. And he takes out a napkin and he starts with the basic fundamentals of trigonometry and he derives it, which said a couple things. One is that he is really, really bright. And two is that he's very vain about how bright he is and loved the fact that he had this opportunity of showing me. And this is another example of the same, but I should first introduce the parties. On the left is Lily, who never dressed like that while we were doing our work. She was always dressed in t-shirt and jeans. But because Castro began every evening session by complimenting her on her appearance, she decided that she would change for those. This is the minister, next to her is the minister of, the head of the Cuban Academy of Sciences, and on the right is the Minister of Health, Jim Martone, with his back to you. What I'm showing to Castro here are some of the enzymatic pathways that I thought were important. At which point he says, you're showing me parts of the Krebs cycle. I said, yeah. You should know the Krebs cycle without having to refer to these charts. Why would I know it? because you have an MD, and I know that in the US you have to know the Krebs cycle to pass your boards. I said, I suppose that's true. Most of us memorize it the night before and forget it the morning after. Um, Castro says, I don't forget so easily. I want you to quiz me on the Krebs cycle every day that we're here. Now, we didn't actually do that, but another opportunity of his to try to show off his steel trap mind. So the first time we examined patients, we began at 7 a.m., had lunch because we didn't know that lunch was always going to be spam. After that, we never had lunch again, and worked until about 7 p.m. On this occasion at 7 p.m., some soldiers came in and told us that we had to go with them quickly. I was actually nervous by their sense of urgency and the fact that they all had rifles on their shoulders, but we got into the van, and I was astonished that as we ran through the city to get 15 minutes away to this hotel of ours, everybody was leaning out their windows staring at us. And it wasn't so astonishing because we were the only vehicle in the streets. Cuba had no gas. Again, to set the stage, about 2 years before the epidemic started, Russia, that had been supporting Cuba in many ways, pulled out its support. And its basic exchange had been buying sugar from Cuba in exchange giving them oil. By oil, I mean gas. And now it was gone, and the Cubans had no gas to run their cars or their tractors in the fields, which aggravated their problem. They couldn't make fertilizer. They couldn't use the plows on their trucks. Later trips showed me that they were actually back to using oxen to plow the fields. So this was suddenly a throwback to hundreds of years of agricultural primitiveness, and it created part of the epidemic. But anyway, we got through the city with everybody staring at us because they wanted to know why was there a car running. We got back to the to my room where Castro was waiting for us, and I understood the urgency was you don't want to keep the commandant waiting. Now, what's interesting is that this happened exactly the same way the next night, except this time I was only 15 minutes away from finishing an exam, and you should know that my exams, especially in those circumstances, was extremely slow. It took me a couple hours to examine a patient, and I wasn't about to lose it for 15 minutes. So I told the soldiers just to wait, and they got really upset, but they waited for 10 or 15 minutes until we got into the van. And this time went roaring off at extremely high speeds to get back. And I understood again, it was embarrassing to them that I should be late for the commandant. So when we arrived at the lobby of the hotel, and I should say it was on a hill, so even though I was sort of like the second or third floor overlooking the downhill side, I was down one flight from the hotel lobby. I raced down those stairs to get down to not make Castro wait too long. When I got to the bottom rung of the stairs, I got hit, tackled, knocked to the ground, all my breath knocked out, flattened with a big guy on top of me. I call that a Cuban bear hug. With no air to say anything, Castro comes over, puts his hands on the shoulder of the soldier, and says, "You can let him up. That's just Sadun." But it was a good point of appreciating the reality that I was not just doing a little side hustle science. I was interacting with the head of state. And had I been running full speed at the American president, it might have gone even worse. When I met with Castro, I would always have in my mind two lists. I'll call them here A and B. The first list was all the findings that he needed to know. And the second was a list of all the people who had screwed up that I didn't want to tell him about because I didn't want responsibility for them getting into trouble. And he would always cut me off as I started to go down list A and ask, first of all, he would flirt and ask Lily how she was doing and how could she look so fresh after I had been driving her so hard. Then he would turn to me and ask about my wife and kids and personal life. And just at the moment that I was most enthusiastic about one of my children, he would interrupt and say, and by the way, that third patient had such and such, what did you think about that? And I would tumble out all the facts that I had, confusing A and B. And the fact that he tricked me the first time should be obvious. But the fact that he successfully did it every night thereafter, to me, makes me feel like I didn't have very, very strong personality. In the back room was Lily with her camera. And this portable camera took pictures of a dilated patient, and she took some history. And later on, we'll talk about some of the key things she found out about that history. If there was any breakthrough, it was due to Lily's history taking. And there's a picture from her camera of one of the fundus of these patients. Now, I don't know how many of you are clinicians, but that picture is absolutely classic for a different disease, not for this disease. I mean, for this disease too. You see that the optic nerve head looks pretty normal, but above it and that whitish area is the nerve fiber layer, and it's gotten much too thick and much too white, so much so that it's obscured that vessel there. And the same thing below. And from this blood vessel to this area, I think you can see the arrow that I'm showing you, is no nerve fiber layer at all. It's been denuded of nerve fiber layers. This is the papillomacular bundle. And it formed what I called the wedge, and later on in different books, they even called it Sadun's wedge. This is pathognomonic for the Cuban epidemic, but in fact, it's not, because we see it in all patients with Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy in the acute stage, the same particular feature. So it may be specific, but not for Cuba. And here is a picture a little later in the process of an optic nerve head, the left. Again, the nerve fiber layer thickened above, thickened below, absence of fibers from here to here with the wedge. But this time there's also some optic atrophy, which occurs after a while. This was from a 35-year-old man who described this 30-pound weight loss over a few months. Then he, near the end of this, lost vision in both eyes, down to well beyond legal blindness. He noted it first because the red shirt of his, that used to be worn by one of his colleagues, had become orange and then eventually gray, and then eventually he couldn't see the colleague's face at all. Some of them had other problems like hearing loss, ataxia, paresthesia, and hyperreflexia. By the way, some of these findings are found in other mitochondrial diseases. It's not specific for Cuba. And what we found out is that all of them smoked or drank, and many of them drank homebrew. This was the Lily insight. She had been trained by me to ask for commonalities. And so she would ask any patient, do you have family members who've gone blind? And most of them actually said no. But she came across one who said, yes, my sister had gone blind about the same time I did. And that really was key because now we could look for what environmental factors they both were exposed to. And she said, do you live together? No. Do you cook together, eat together? No, no. What do you do together? We go on walks every 2 weeks into the woods, which struck Lily as a very odd thing for a brother and sister to do. But she pursued that to the point that they admitted that the walks in the woods were in order to make a contact to pick up rum. They both really liked drinking rum. And the rum they were getting was homebrew. Now, this is not bad rum. This is not the same as the wood alcohol that we know will poison you. Wood alcohol has high levels of methanol, so much so that the brain undergoes formic acidosis. The brain swells, the patient may go into a coma, they may wake up blind, or just as likely they won't wake up at all and they'll die. That's a very serious disease, much more acute and much worse. But the home brew was made the same as it should have been for rum, but it was not aged because it was illegal. They weren't going to sit around and wait for 2 years to wait for it to age. So it was properly made rum that was not properly aged. At this point, it was our last day in Cuba, so we said that we wanted to make a report, and we had some epidemiology to do, which I'm not going to get into too much detail, except to say that this wedge of nerve fiber layers that was missing was key in making the diagnosis. And to my surprise, because until then everybody had been so cordial, we got a whole lot of pushback. I sat in a room with the heads of each of the groups of the National Operative Group, and they criticized a lot of parts of this, mostly saying, which we expected early but got late, you guys have been here 1 week. We've been here for a year. There's 1,000 of us. You don't understand the nuances of this disease. Mostly, they didn't like the idea that with this definition, there would be patients of theirs that they thought had gone blind from the disease who would be excluded. I tried hard to say that that wasn't that they would be excluded from medical care. They would just be excluded from consideration for the epidemiology. I put the usual Venn diagrams up on some flowcharts to try to talk about false positives and false negatives. But it was a very hard sell, and it went on for 2 hours. During that period of time, at this press conference, one of the awkward things that happened is that there were 2 microphones. One was floating around that they would use as they asked questions, the other one in my hands. And I got so nervous that I was starting to flip the microphone on and off as the fidget. And at one point, it was obviously on, and I thought that it was off. And somebody said something pretty dumb, and I leaned over to Martone and whispered in a way that, of course, boomed across the room because I had the microphone up against me. I don't think so, with that little childlike tone that says that you're being very sarcastic. And it was horrible, but the whole room burst into laughter, and it was probably very good. So Castro took advantage of that at the end. And he says, I think we've talked about it enough. So I'm glad we're all agreed. We'll do it Sadun's way. So we posed for this picture. And I thank Castro for all his courtesies. And he said, wait a minute. Why are we posing for this final picture? And what are you behaving as if you're leaving? I said, our flight is scheduled to leave tomorrow, the charter flight that the State Department got us. I'll be back in 6 weeks. But Castro was very upset. He actually had tears running down his eyes. He's either a good actor or he really feels empathy. He says, every day that you're gone, hundreds of patients go blind. It's changing their lives forever. You can't go back. Then he made a joke, and he'd been making lots of jokes, but this was the joke that I did not find funny. He said that the name of the airport is the Jose Marti Airport. He says, it's called that, but you know, it's my airport. I own it. And tomorrow it's going to be closed, so I guess you can't fly out. And obviously, I perceived the veiled threat, and I got probably very upset. I'm sure the color ran out of my face. And I could tell by his face that he felt that maybe he had gone too far with that threat. He whispers some things to other people, and about 10 or 15 minutes later, somebody comes in with a phone. Now, remember, this is long before cell phones. This phone was attached to many, many feet of cord going all the way out to someplace. And then he takes the phone and he chats, and I'm thinking, that's an odd interruption. And then as he's chatting longer, I'm thinking, this is very social, what he's saying on the phone. And he's speaking in English, by the way. I wonder who it is. And then I realized I know who it is. It's my wife, Deborah. That even though the State Department had said that there was no phone communication between Cuba and the US, and I could never call home, it was only a matter of patching it through a third country for that to happen. And it did. And he explains to Deborah that he wants her to call the hospital and cancel my surgeries and cancel my appointments and tell everybody that I need to spend another week in Cuba. And then he starts to joke with her and says, by the way, he's right here. He's not in a dungeon. And I'll let him speak for himself that he's being well taken care of, and passes the phone to me. And I did awkwardly say, yes, everything he said was true. Could she cover for me? And that I'd be back in a week. Deborah didn't seem nervous, and I was still a little nervous. So what happened? We decided it was a two-hit disease process. Number one, a deficiency of vitamins, most particularly folic acid. And one thing that helped me convince the group that this was true is I also made a prediction at that same press conference that there should be high rates of spina bifida. And somebody went off to look for it and came back and said, yes, they were up 100-fold. And that, of course, is a reflection of folic acid deficiency in pregnancy. And the second thing, the second hit, was formate, not acidosis, but a little bit of formate. Now, that's what methanol becomes, formate. And formate can directly block oxidative phosphorylation. And in my thinking, at least, formate is a natural byproduct of fermentation. And it should be made by every process of making alcohol. And so it's going to be in the rum anyway. But when you age the rum, because formate has a vapor pressure much, much higher than ethanol, it's going to disappear relative to ethanol. And unaged rum, it's going to be there in higher concentrations. Now, ordinarily, a little bit of formate won't hurt you because it gets detoxified. But part of the enzymatic process that detoxifies it is folic acid, hence the two hits and the absence of folic acid. Now, if you're missing folic acid, not only does that mean you can't detoxify formate, but that too will lead to blockage of oxidative phosphorylation. So the poor mitochondria were getting hit from two sides. Castro asked what we could do about it. I tried my own version of a joke. I made a bad joke, didn't work, about capitalism. I said, if you don't want people buying something in the US, all you have to do is sell something better for less. So you could take your aged rum, and instead of selling it to Europe to get dollars, which is what they were trying to do, which is why I should have mentioned, and I'll tell you now, that people could not buy aged rum in Cuba anymore. They were so short on dollars that the ration cars that used to have rum no longer had rum on them. So they had to get rum any way they could. The good rum was being exported. And my joke was, you can simply keep it, maybe even import some more, and everybody will stop drinking the bad rum. And he said, that sounds really expensive. And then I admitted I was just joking. The answer, of course, was to provide folic acid to everybody. Within a few days, the Spanish government committed to the process, provided vast amounts of folic acid and folate, it's the same thing, of course, to the Cubans. And it was delivered in a process that could never have happened in the US because there the primary care physician lives with his patients and had to visit every patient and sign off that he witnessed them taking the pills that he handled them. Castro asked me to come back, this time inviting Deborah, and we maintained a bit of a correspondence with the Swiss embassy as intermediaries for the next few weeks. One of the things I was able to do was, well, I should say was not able to do, was get some of the cheap rum. When we finally flew out, I hadn't found any means of getting it. However, one of the few times, maybe the only time I've ever found a press conference with American press to be useful is when I came back to Miami, the New York Times interviewed me. And although they got everything wrong about the story, they sort of interpreted it as meaning that Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, a genetic disease, had been caused by bad rum. But what they did get right is that I wanted them at the cheap rum, and I couldn't get it. The next morning after that, I got a call from an ophthalmologist from Cuba, from Canada, and he says, I can get you that rum if it's important. I said, it's very important, but how are you going to get it? He says, I'm Canadian. I don't have to follow the embargo rules. I'm just going to get on a commercial flight, fly to Cuba. And I know some people at high places who'll get me the rum. And 2 days later, I got a FedEx of 2 bottles of rum from him, which I sent off to 2 different labs, 1 bottle to each lab. And I also sent off the 2 bottles of very fine 6-year aged rum that Castro had given me as a parting gift. See how much I think that science is more important than an evening of rum. And though there's the chart, the 2 bottles of aged rum was non-detectable. The systems only went down to 0.01%. The bootleg rum was almost 1% methanol. Again, that bottle of rum would have gotten me drunk and maybe given me a headache, but would have done me no permanent damage. But I have folic acid. We still had to confirm this experimentally in my lab, and on subsequent trips, I was able to get lots of blood samples and CSF samples and measure them, and found out that their serum folate levels were very low and formate levels are high, even in the CSF, a lot of formate. So my first model of this was a rat model, which got me an NIH grant, where we would feed the rats a folic acid deficient diet, but also give them antibiotics so that their intestines were not filled with bacteria that would have provided their own folic acid. And then we gave them injections of methanol. I watched them stagger around rather drunk, titrated the doses to be exactly equivalent to the levels that we had found in the Cubans, and we made the rats blind. And more than that, when we looked in the optic nerve, we found little vacuoles filled with mitochondria that matched the appearance of an optic nerve. One optic nerve from all of the Castro's patients died in an accident, and they saved the eye for me very graciously for that comparison. But anyway, on the first trip, finally on leaving, he said to come back. He invited Deborah, and he said in letters that followed that I was batting 500. He liked to use baseball analogies all the time, metaphors, because he used to play baseball a lot. He said that I was right, the folic acid stopped the epidemic, but I was wrong because I said the patients wouldn't get any better and they had gotten vastly improved, which I found very hard to believe. I did go back to sort of check on that. And there's the trip where I took Rebecca. My wife very graciously figured out Rebecca would probably get more out of it. And so there she is with Lily. And this time we were a little bit more touristic, visiting a bar where Hemingway used to be and so on. But this is what I wanted to show you, that Castro was sort of right, but not completely. With the average visual acuities before being 2400 in the same patients, it improved to 2050, but it certainly did not come back to 2020. And optic atrophy now occurred. This picture on the right shows that the thickening of the nerve fiber layer that we saw before up here and down here is down. My histopathology of that one case and of the rats shows that thickening is due to the fact that the axons are constipated, filled with mitochondria. It's not real nerve fiber layer swelling or discedema. It's varicosities of mitochondria, as if the system is saying, we'll make up a number for what isn't working in quality. And whether that compensation provides value or not, I don't know. But you can now see the wedge even better than before. From there to there, that darker hue is because there's no nerve fiber layer on top of it. And it was actually a much bigger deal than I may have suggested to get these patients to be examined, because they had been scattered throughout the country. And initially they told me it was impossible. But when they found me very unhappy about that situation, they made arrangements for the military to pick them up with helicopters and bring them to Havana so I could re-examine the very same patients and compile this chart in a publication. Here in the upper left, you see the rates of the disease and where they started to give folic acid, it came down. So what's traveling 26 kilometers a day from west to east in that wave front, if it's not a virus like the Cubans thought, and obviously this is the joke, it's the donkey cart. That's about what a donkey cart could do in a day, 26 kilometers filled with rum. It happened because of the embargo that the US imposed in 1960 and the Russian pullout in 92. It happened because of the famine that created. It happened because of central planning, that they rationed the rum that people had and they had to find another way of making rum, getting rum. And even the vegetable gardens, the Cubans had provided seeds to everybody and said, this is what you'll grow. Never mind things like broccoli and lettuce, which you might like. You got to get high calorie foods. And so they shifted away from the sort of greens that would have provided folic acid. And I think obviously these things that you can read on your own, but there's this cult of personality, which was a weakness in trying to analyze what was going on there, but also was a strength in terms of the administration of folic acid that never would have worked in the US the way it worked in Cuba. And it, for me, provided an opportunity of developing more of a science of mitochondrial optic neuropathy. The Cuban epidemic is an example. Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy is another. Certain toxins like that produced by thiametol, it's an antibiotic that chelates, and in doing so, damages the ribosomes of mitochondria, and these various deficiencies that can interfere with mitochondrial reactions. So it was after this that I started in my publications making reference to this idea of a mitochondrial optic neuropathy, which encompasses about 20 diseases that have been separately described before. And here's that very same concept of genetic causes of mitochondrial optic neuropathy are Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy and dominant optic atrophy. There are deficiencies like B12 and folic acid. There's toxins, usually antibiotics that knock out the 50S subunit of ribosomes. And there's syndromic effects such as those. They all involve the same fundamental pathophysiology to the optic nerves. So in short, this was an acquired version of Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. And the pathways involved were a little different than in Leber's. This shows Leber's. But the key thing here is to realize that it's not a bioenergetic crisis. It's the electron spillage that produces reactive oxygen species. The environment obviously can provide you some more reactive oxygen species, leads to the electrical potential across the mitochondria dropping such that the MPTP pore opens and apoptosis develops. And what's interesting about the retinal ganglion cell in the retina is depicted in this cartoon is here's the cell with all these events that I just talked about. And these are the mitochondria with the varicosities that I was telling you about, is that this stretch here is called the retinal nerve fiber layer. It is unmyelinated because myelin is opaque. And light has to go through this to get to the rods and cones. And this is key because this changes the efficiency of the system enormously because the energy consumption is the membrane getting depolarized, which in the myelinated portions of the optic nerve or elsewhere in the brain goes from nodneuron VA to nodneuron VA, skipping 99% of the membrane. Without myelin, you have now 2 orders, maybe closer to 3 orders of magnitude more energy consumed. And as energy is consumed, you need to have more mitochondria to provide the ATP. And you end up stressing the system. So I don't think Castro knew that in giving us access to all these patients in Cuba, he was contributing to our understanding of mitochondrial optic neuropathies. And certainly at that time, I didn't know a coincidence that just occurred, which is that a few weeks ago, this book came out that tells the whole story. And it's available on Amazon.com. Cuba's Epidemic of Blindness, How Yankees Solved Castro's Medical Mystery. It's written by Bruce Shields, who's he's a maven in glaucoma, used to be at Duke and at Yale. Now he's retired to do such silly things as write these books. But he heard this lecture some 35 years ago and has been researching it ever since and came out with the book only a few weeks ago. So thank you very much. I think that I'm about on time for what you suggested. I'd be very happy to entertain any question.
Wow, this was amazing. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask?
So this is Steve Fleisler. Alfredo, I love that presentation, and I love your style as
Thank
well.
you, Steve.
I do have a question. Since that you've discovered that these specific antibiotics are problematic, have there been any changes in use of antibiotics since you discovered this?
Yes, a change in protocol. Just to give an example, um, as we published, ethambutol overuse has led to about 100,000 patients going blind per year in the world. That's just an astonishing thing considering that it's all preventable. Um, and mostly it's little old ladies or um, skinny people from Cambodia who have tuberculosis who are given the same dosages that have been worked out by the pharmaceutical community in the United States with big, robust men. And it should be titrated according to surface area, not exactly body weight, but something like that. But more importantly, you eliminate ethambutol through the kidneys. If you have kidney disease or just age, because kidney function goes down with age, you don't get rid of it and the levels are too high. So the CDC now has a protocol, and the protocol allows for lower doses of ethambutol. And if you have kidney disease, we're giving the ethambutol 3 days a week instead of every day. And that seems to have worked extremely well to reduce the rates of blindness from ethambutol. They're also, as part of their protocol, suggest that you have 3 antibiotics until the cultures come back that show sensitivity for another one. And then if that's the case, after 2 months of being on ethambutol, you get taken off of it. And so with all that, it's almost impossible to have ethambutol toxicity in the United States. Let's hope everybody around the world is following those protocols. But yeah, it gave us some insights.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So one question that puzzles me a little bit here is this Cuban epidemic the onset seemed to be very rapid, or maybe I got that wrong. But if you have, a deficiency, wouldn't you expect that to be relatively slow in setting in?
So if you mean that the epidemic blossomed rapidly, I would agree with you. At the very beginning of 1993, it just blew up. And I had a hard time understanding that, and I still don't understand it, but I have one thought, which is common in medicine. We see it all the time, which is people don't think of things until they do. And so it could well be that there was a lot more of that epidemic than we thought in 1992, unreported because it was confusing. If by rapid onset you mean the patient, that too is very interesting because you're right again. Many of these patients describe their loss of vision as occurring over a couple of weeks. And in a deficiency state, we usually see it developing over many months. Maybe the two hits somehow accelerated a threshold process in a way that wouldn't happen in just a pure deficiency state. I have nothing more than that in my thinking.
Thank you.
I have a few. I'll try and limit it if people need to leave. But so one of the therapies that they tried before you arrived was hyperbaric oxygen. Is that right?
It is.
And so my expectation with any kind of mitochondrial, disorder affecting electron transport would be that hyperbaric oxygen makes it worse.
I think you're right. I should tell you, I have now had anecdotally several patients with labors who, after they lost vision in one eye, went through hyperbaric oxygen and lost vision in the second eye immediately thereafter. I'm convinced it makes it worse.
Yeah, but they didn't report that to you. And so
No, they didn't.
maybe they
But
didn't want to say it. I don't know, but
obviously, nobody there wanted to tell Castro that they had made things worse. But it's also true that these studies were done very badly. They had these protocols, but they had terrible confounds. These were patients taken from impoverished corners of the island and put into the hospital where they were being fed regular food. So they were probably being nutritionally supported in ways that were uniform across all the protocols because they just weren't thinking along those lines.
And you mentioned that you have to give your animal model of Lieber's antibiotic, but these patients, did they have any, did their, I guess, microbiome not support folic acid synthesis, or is there something sort of that would explain why in the animal model you have to treat it differently than the patients might have been treated?
I don't know. It's a good question, but as I was working with Janice Els in Wisconsin, who's an expert on certain issues, she explained to me that rats are really good at absorbing folic acid from the bacteria, and I would have to do that. I tried not doing that, but the folic acid levels wouldn't go down. I tried adding the antibiotics, and she was right. But the humans did achieve low folic acid levels, as we found out, without anything destroying the microbiome. I don't know.
And then I think you briefly mentioned that in the process of vision loss, there was a loss of color before a loss of a complete loss of vision. Is
Yes.
that right?
Yes.
So is there something also affecting photoreceptors or a type of ganglion cell that carries color vision more?
The second. You're right, and it's because the papillomacular bundle, that very area that's involved that produces the wedge, those are very small fibers, and that turns out to be key. And they're the ones that carry the color vision. And so when you lose that papillomacular bundle, you want it to be really accurate. It's not an optic neuropathy; it's a papillomacular opathy. Then you're going to have color as a very early loss of vision. High contrast high spatial frequency contrast sensitivity is another thing you lose because those fibers carry that. Being small means that those fibers suffer in terms of surface area to volume ratios. Remember, it's the membrane getting depolarized as the energy consumer. It's the axon volume that gives you enough mitochondria to provide the energy. And these mitochondria are already jam-packed in theirs to the extent that you need to have varicosities. So the smaller the fiber, the more vulnerable the fiber. And those fibers that are in the very center are the smallest and carry color. And by the way, they're the smallest because of the fact that they have the shortest distance to travel. Between the center of your vision and the disc, it's a short trip, whereas far out in the periphery, it's a longer trip. And because you want the conduction to be normalized by the time you get to the brain, all the information arriving at the same time, you speed things up with a large axon, and that is necessary for the distant travel. It's all very elegantly arranged by evolution.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
I seem to recall that the way to treat methanol poisoning is with ethanol. Is that, I don't know, is that actually true? And if so,
That's actually true. Irrelevant to this story, but very true. But you're trying to capture it at an earlier stage. So you've got the liver trying to detoxify to enzymatically convert methanol and ethanol. If all the enzyme is tied up converting ethanol, there's less enzyme available to convert the methanol, and you slow the translation of methanol to formate.
it's a competitive inhibitor, right?
Yes, sort of.
They would have had to have a source of ethanol not contaminated with methanol to do that.
And number one, and they would have had to have it done first, early on.
Yeah, right.
I wonder if anybody considered a combined therapy to add like an N-acetylcysteamide or something like that will knock out ROS.
Would have been cool, but no. I think the Cubans were dealing with a big problem, and were under economic duress, and they were looking for a simple solution.
Got it. I mean, people may or may not know that that's what, if you go to the ER with acetaminophen overdose, that's what they give you.
All right. Thank you so much for giving this talk. It was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you. I'm glad any opportunity to meet with the members of your lab. That's fun. Oh, and Jim, I think I'll see you in just another month down in Irvine.
It looks like a good meeting. Yeah.
Good.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
Good luck
you.
with your new digs, Alfredo.
Yeah, it looks